My husband brought his mother who had cancer home for me to take care of, and then went on a business trip for 9 months. Before she passed away, she grabbed my arm and whispered with her final breath, "Dig in the kitchen corner under the pickle jar." I thought it was the heavy medication talking. But when I finally pried up the loose floorboards in the pantry and opened the rusted metal box hidden underneath, I realized my entire marriage was a calculated, vicious lie. What I found inside that box gave me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy the man who thought he could throw me away like garbage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. My name is Kiara. I am 31 years old, and somehow I am still healing from the wounds my in-laws inflicted on me. I run a small meal prep catering business in Atlanta, a passion I put on hold to be a devoted wife. The air in my living room was thick with the scent of fried chicken collard greens and the overwhelming floral notes of expensive perfumes. It was the afternoon of Miss Ruby's repast, the traditional gathering after a funeral in our community. I stood exhausted behind the folding tables I had set up myself, serving plates of hot food to a house full of people who had not visited once during the 9 painful months she was dying. I had not slept a full night in almost a year. My lower back ached constantly, my eyes were swollen from crying, and my black morning dress felt heavy and suffocating in the crowded room. But I kept serving the food. I kept a polite smile on my face. Because that is what a dutiful wife is supposed to do. Miss Ruby was my mother-in-law, but in the end I was the only person in this house who truly acted like her family. All around me my husband's relatives laughed, drank my homemade lemonade, and casually exchanged business cards as if this were a corporate networking event rather than a memorial service. Just as I was wiping down the serving station, Chantel marched over. Chantel is my husband DeAndre's younger sister. At 29 years old, she lived a life funded entirely by high-limit credit cards and a massive sense of entitlement. She wore an inappropriate red dress and carried a large glass of wine. She looked at the food I spent 2 days preparing and wrinkled her nose. "Are you going to serve this cheap catering food to our guests all day?" she asked loudly, making the room go quiet. Before I could answer, she flicked her wrist. The full glass of dark red wine splashed violently across the front of my black dress, staining it instantly and dripping onto my shoes. "Oops," she said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips, not sounding the least bit sorry. My hand gripped the edge of the table. "Chantel," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "Please do not start this drama today. We are here to honor your mother." "Honor her?" Chantel scoffed loudly, taking an aggressive step closer to me. "You do not know the first thing about honoring this family. You are just mad because the free gravy train is officially over. By the way, are your bags packed yet? DeAndre is listing this house on the real estate market tomorrow morning, so you need to wrap up this little cafeteria gig and get out of here." I stared at her, my deep exhaustion suddenly turning into a sharp anger. "Excuse me," I asked. "This is my home. I have lived here with your brother for 5 years." Chantel laughed a sharp, ugly sound. "Your home," she repeated mockingly. "You were never part of this family. You were just the hired help. DeAndre needed someone to change my mother's dirty diapers while he was in London closing million-dollar real estate deals. You are nothing but a glorified nurse with a spatula." Her venomous words hit me like a physical blow. While DeAndre was supposedly overseas, I paused my business. I bathed Miss Ruby every single morning when she was too weak to stand. I crushed her bitter pain pills into applesauce. I held her hand during terrifying midnight hospital runs, while Chantel posted luxury vacation photos from Miami, and DeAndre sent my frantic calls straight to voicemail. I looked Chantel up and down, refusing to back away. "Where were you when she was begging for water at 3 in the morning?" "Chantel," I demanded, my voice finally rising enough for everyone to hear. "I did not see you or your brother holding the pan when she was throwing up from the harsh chemotherapy treatments. You both abandoned her when she needed you the most." Chantel's eyes flashed with pure venom. She stepped forward, raising her manicured hand as if she might actually slap me. "You watch your trashy mouth," she hissed viciously. "You are nothing but a desperate gold digger who got lucky for a few years. But your time is completely up." Before Chantel could swing her hand, the heavy front door swung open, hitting the drywall with a loud thud. DeAndre walked in. My husband wore a custom-tailored black suit that cost more than my catering van. He did not look like a grieving son. He looked like a triumphant man, arriving at a victory party. Walking right beside him was a tall, sharp-featured older man carrying a thick leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately as DeAndre's aggressive corporate attorney. The crowded room instantly parted for them. DeAndre did not even glance at the guests. He walked straight up to me, his cold, dismissive gaze, taking in my wine-stained dress and my tired face. He did not offer any comfort. He did not ask if I was okay. Instead, he snapped his fingers and the lawyer opened the briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents. DeAndre snatched the papers and slapped them down forcefully on the food table, right next to a tray of deviled eggs. "Sign these right now," he demanded, his deep voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. I looked down at the bold black print on the first page. It was a formal petition for divorce. My chest tightened painfully, and the air seemed to rapidly leave my lungs. "DeAndre, what is this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a cracked whisper. I could feel the judgmental eyes of dozens of his family members burning into my skin. "It is exactly what it looks like," he said, smoothly adjusting his expensive silk tie. "I am filing for divorce. This dead-weight marriage is officially over. Furthermore, this house was purchased entirely by me before we were legally married. It is my separate asset under the law. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your cheap pots and pans and vacate my property for good." I stood staring at the papers meant to erase 5 years of my life. "You are doing this today?" I asked, trembling. "We just buried your mother 3 hours ago." DeAndre leaned in close, smelling of mint and strong cologne. "My mother is gone," he whispered, his eyes devoid of warmth. "I do not need a live-in nurse anymore. You served your purpose. Now take the hint and leave before I have you thrown out by the police." The lawyer stepped forward loudly, tapping a heavy silver pen against the divorce papers. "We strongly advise you to sign the preliminary agreement now, ma'am," the lawyer said in a flat, robotic tone. "It permanently waives your right to any spousal support or alimony, which is entirely fair considering you brought absolutely no financial assets into this marriage. If you try to fight this in court, my client will bury you in endless legal fees until you are completely bankrupt." The entire room was watching me, waiting for me to shatter. Chantel was smiling broadly, taking another long sip from her wineglass. Jamal, Chantel's husband, was snickering loudly in the corner. They all expected me to completely break down. They expected me to cry, to beg DeAndre for mercy, to plead for a place to stay. But as I stood there looking at the cruel, arrogant faces of the people I had sacrificed everything for, I did not shed a single tear. My tears had dried up weeks ago. Instead, I vividly remembered the heavy brass key and the encrypted computer drive currently sitting safe inside my pocket. I remembered the final breathless words Miss Ruby had spoken to me in the dark. I took a deep, calming breath, looked DeAndre dead in the eyes, and calmly folded his expensive divorce papers in half, ready for absolute war. "To the hospital or the pharmacy?" Every single cent, hundreds of thousands of dollars, was wired directly into the primary operating account of his commercial real estate firm, Apex Holdings. He literally stole his dying mother's cancer treatment money to prop up his failing business and to buy $1 million mansion for his mistress. Miss Ruby had known everything. She had laid in that bed, trapped in her failing body, watching her own son deny her life-saving medication while he selfishly drained her accounts. The sheer calculating evil of it was breathtaking. I printed every single document, every bank statement, and every GPS log from the drive. I placed them carefully into a thick leather binder. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in the dark kitchen waiting for the sun to rise, feeling like a completely different person. The devastated, exhausted widow was gone forever. Miss Ruby had chosen me to be her instrument of absolute vengeance, and I was not going to let her down. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the aggressive roar of a heavy diesel engine shattered the quiet morning. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a massive white contractor truck pulling aggressively onto my manicured back lawn, its heavy tires tearing deep tracks into the grass. Chantel jumped out of the passenger side wearing oversized designer sunglasses and holding a large iced coffee. Two burly men, in heavy work boots and bright reflective vests, climbed out of the back, pulling heavy steel sledgehammers from the truck bed. I marched straight out the back door and stood firmly on the concrete patio, crossing my arms over my chest. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I demanded loudly over the rumble of the idling truck engine. Chantel took a casual sip of her iced coffee and smiled brightly, clearly enjoying the confrontation. "I am doing DeAndre a huge favor," she announced proudly, walking closer to my pristine commercial prep kitchen. "The real estate agent is coming to take high-end listing photos right at noon. This ugly, grease-stained commercial kitchen you built out here completely ruins the luxury aesthetic of the property. It drags down the listing value terribly. So we are smashing it to pieces right now. You can take your little pots and pans with you when you finally get evicted tomorrow." She gestured wildly to the two men behind her. "Go ahead and start swinging, guys. Rip all of this cheap garbage out." I stepped directly in front of the heavy wooden doors of my prep kitchen, planting my feet solidly on the cold concrete. The two men stopped immediately, lowering their hammers and looking uncertainly at Chantel. "If either of you takes one more step toward my business property, I am calling the police and pressing felony criminal trespassing charges," I said, my voice cutting through the crisp morning air like a jagged knife. Chantel rolled her eyes dramatically, thoroughly annoyed by my defiance. "Call them," she challenged, laughing a sharp, mocking laugh. "Call the cops right now. Show them the deed to the house." "Oh, wait, you cannot. DeAndre owns this property free and clear, and I am acting on his direct written orders. Move out of the way or my guys will physically move you." I did not blink. I reached into my apron pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and immediately dialed 911. I loudly and clearly reported a hostile home invasion in progress by unauthorized contractors wielding heavy tools. The two men exchanged nervous glances and immediately backed away, clearly unwilling to catch a criminal charge for a petty wealthy family dispute. Chantel's smug smile vanished in an instant. "You are completely insane," she screamed, her face turning bright red with sudden, uncontrollable fury. "You have 48 hours left in this house. You are just delaying the inevitable." I completely ignored her screaming. I grabbed my purse, locked the heavy deadbolt on the kitchen door, and walked right past her to my catering van. "Stay right here and wait for the police, Chantel," I said coldly without looking back. "I have a very important errand to run downtown." I sped through the morning Atlanta traffic, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. I pulled into the polished marble lobby of the First National Bank of Atlanta, right as the heavy glass doors unlocked for the morning business hours. I walked straight up to the high-security vault desk and placed Miss Ruby's heavy brass key quietly on the polished mahogany counter. The senior bank manager, a dignified older gentleman named Mr. Harrison, looked at the heavy antique key and then up at my face. His eyes softened with immediate recognition and a deep, surprising respect. "Ah, Miss Kiara," he said softly, keeping his voice strictly professional. "I was deeply saddened to hear about Miss Ruby's passing yesterday. She was a brilliant, formidable woman. She told me to expect you very soon." He led me past the heavy steel security gates and down into the silent, climate-controlled underground vault. He used his master key in tandem with my brass key to pull out a massive, heavy steel deposit box from the towering wall of lockers. He left me entirely alone in a small private viewing room, illuminated by a single warm desk lamp. I took a deep breath and opened the heavy metal lid. Inside was a thick, meticulously organized stack of official, red-stamped government documents. They were not just any standard financial papers. They were property tax deeds, mortgage lien assignments, and complex corporate holding registrations. I sat down and read through the dense legal jargon very carefully, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. Mr. Harrison knocked gently and entered the room a few minutes later, holding a fresh cup of black coffee. "I see you found the Shadow Corporation documents," he said quietly, sitting in the leather chair directly across from me. I looked at him, my mind racing at light speed to comprehend the massive scale of the legal weapon I was currently holding. DeAndre defaulted on the mortgage for the house, I stated flatly, more of a solid realization than an actual question. Mr. Harrison nodded gravely, adjusting his glasses. "4 years ago," he explained methodically, "your husband leveraged the house to the absolute maximum limit to fund his risky commercial real estate ventures. When he missed 6 consecutive payments, our bank initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings. He was going to lose the house completely to public auction. Miss Ruby found out through her own financial channels. But instead of bailing him out directly and letting him continue his reckless behavior, she used a blind trust LLC to quietly purchase the entire debt portfolio from the bank. DeAndre thought a mysterious corporate investor bought his loan and granted him a generous extension. He had absolutely no idea that his own mother became his legal landlord. I stared at the official papers in my hands, feeling the sheer weight of her brilliant strategy. "And this document right here?" I asked, tapping a notarized transfer certificate bearing a fresh gold seal. Mr. Harrison smiled, a sharp, fiercely approving look in his old eyes. 3 weeks ago, when she realized exactly how little time she had left, Miss Ruby legally and irrevocably transferred total ownership of that blind trust LLC entirely to you. You do not just live in that house, Kiara. You hold the exclusive mortgage lien. DeAndre is in massive unrecoverable default. You have the absolute legal right to seize the property immediately and lock him out permanently." The drive back to my house felt entirely different. The crushing weight of the divorce papers had completely evaporated. I was no longer a helpless victim being chased out of my own home by an arrogant tyrant. I was the absolute legal authority. When I pulled up to the curb, 2 Atlanta police cruisers were already parked aggressively on the front lawn, their blue lights flashing brightly in the morning sun. Chantel was standing on the porch crying fake dramatic tears and gesturing wildly at the 2 uniformed officers. "She is a crazy, bitter ex-wife," Chantel whined loudly as I walked confidently up the driveway. "My brother owns this house. She is violently refusing to leave and preventing us from doing necessary property renovations. Arrest her right now for trespassing and disturbing the peace." The older police officer turned to me, his expression stern and deeply annoyed by the suburban drama. "Ma'am," he said firmly, resting his hand on his radio, "if your husband is the sole legal owner of this property, as this young woman claims, you cannot physically block authorized contractors. We are going to have to ask you to step aside, pack your belongings, or face immediate arrest." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or act hysterical. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick red stamped lien assignment I had just retrieved from the bank vault. I handed it directly to the officer. "My husband does not own this property, officer," I said, my voice steady, professional, and commanding. "This property is currently under active lien foreclosure by my private holding company due to severe financial default. I am the primary lien holder and the sole legal custodian of the estate. These people do not have my permission to be here, and they are attempting to destroy my commercial property." The officer frowned deeply, carefully reading the official court-stamped documents. He looked closely at the gold legal seal, verified my driver's license, and then turned his stern, uncompromising gaze directly onto Chantel. Chantel's fake tears stopped instantly, replaced by genuine confusion. "What is that?" she demanded nervously, trying to peek over the tall officer's shoulder. "It is a fake. It has to be a fake document." The officer handed the heavy papers safely back to me and rested his hand heavily on his duty belt, stepping aggressively toward Chantel. "These documents are perfectly legal and federally binding, ma'am," he said strictly. "This woman is the legal lien holder of this property. You and your contractors are currently committing criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. I suggest you pack up your trucks and leave this property immediately before I place all three of you in handcuffs and tow your vehicles. Chantel's jaw dropped open in absolute horror. She looked at me, her eyes wide with sudden terrifying realization that she had walked straight into a massive trap. I stood on the porch looking down at her and smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. You heard the officer, Chantel, I said smoothly. Get off my property. Chantel's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth to scream a string of vicious insults, but the older police officer took a single highly authoritative step forward, resting his hand firmly on his heavy-duty radio. Chantel wisely snapped her mouth shut. She spun around violently, her expensive designer heels clicking furiously on the concrete driveway, and stormed back to her idling contractor truck. She aggressively ordered the two bewildered demolition men to pack up their heavy sledgehammers immediately. She slammed her passenger door so hard the entire truck physically shook and sped off down the suburban street, leaving dark tire marks on the asphalt. The two police officers tipped their hats to me respectfully and pulled away a few minutes later, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet, crisp morning air. I walked back inside my house, locked the heavy deadbolt, and placed the thick leather binder of legal and financial documents safely on the highest shelf in my pantry. I had won the morning battle, but I knew my husband would never let this humiliating defeat go unanswered. I did not have to wait long. Less than 4 hours later, a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled smoothly into my driveway. I was standing in the kitchen carefully wiping down the granite countertops when I heard the heavy front door unlock. DeAndre strode rapidly into the foyer, his face dark with suppressed violent rage. But he was not alone. Walking closely behind him was the exact woman from the private investigator's hidden surveillance photos. It was Vanessa. Seeing her in person was a completely different experience than looking at a printed photograph on a computer screen. She was stunningly tall, wearing a tailored cream-colored pantsuit that screamed expensive taste and carrying a pristine designer leather handbag. She moved with the effortless, arrogant grace of a woman who was entirely used to getting whatever she wanted without question. DeAndre did not even bother to knock or announce his aggressive presence. He walked straight into the kitchen, his dark, furious eyes locked onto mine. Chantel called me. He said, his voice dangerously low and tight with anger. She told me some ridiculous lie about you showing the police a forged bank document to stop the property demolition. I do not know what kind of desperate, pathetic game you are trying to play today, Kiara, but it ends right now. I stepped back from the kitchen counter, wiping my hands calmly on a white dish towel. There was no game, DeAndre, I replied evenly, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. I simply showed the authorities the legal truth regarding the status of this property. Vanessa stepped out from behind DeAndre, her high heels echoing loudly on the hardwood floor. She looked around my kitchen with a highly exaggerated expression of utter distaste, her eyes scanning the commercial-grade refrigerators and the neatly organized spice racks as if she were inspecting a dirty, abandoned subway station. So this is the famous catering setup, she said, her voice dripping with thick condescension. It is incredibly outdated and thoroughly unappealing. We will definitely need to gut this entire space down to the studs before we schedule the open house. The cheap smell of fried food has completely permeated the drywall. I looked directly at her, refusing to show any signs of intimidation. And who exactly are you? I asked, feigning absolute ignorance of her true identity. DeAndre stepped closer to her, a cruel, mocking smile rapidly replacing his previous anger. This is Vanessa, he announced proudly, gesturing to the tall woman. She is my senior luxury real estate broker. Since you are stubbornly refusing to vacate the premises gracefully and choosing to harass my family members, Vanessa is here to do a comprehensive property walkthrough and prepare the official listing documents. We are putting the house on the market tomorrow morning, regardless of your little temper tantrums. Vanessa did not wait for my permission or acknowledge my presence any further. She casually strolled out of the kitchen and into the living room, running her manicured fingers aggressively over the antique wooden furniture Miss Ruby had cherished for decades. She picked up a framed photograph of Miss Ruby and DeAndre from the brick mantel, looked at it for a brief second with a bored expression, and carelessly placed it face down on the shelf. "This entire aesthetic is terribly depressing," Vanessa called out loudly from the living room. "We need to hire a professional staging company immediately to remove all this old junk. It honestly smells like a nursing home in here." My hands clenched tightly into fists at my sides, my short fingernails digging painfully deep into my palms. I wanted to march straight into the living room and throw her forcefully out the front door. I wanted to scream loudly that I knew exactly who she was sleeping with and exactly whose stolen money bought her expensive designer pantsuit. But I forced my tense muscles to relax completely. I needed them entirely blind to the truth. I needed DeAndre to deeply believe he was completely in control of the narrative and holding all the power. DeAndre noticed my sudden silence and clearly misinterpreted it as weak submission. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, towering over me in the confined kitchen area. He pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at my face. "Listen to me very carefully." He threatened, his voice a harsh, aggressive whisper meant to instill deep fear. "I do not care what fake legal papers you printed off the internet to fool a local beat cop. My company, Apex Holdings, just secured the largest commercial real estate deal in the history of Midtown Atlanta. I am officially closing a billion-dollar skyscraper development project this month. Do you seriously think you have the financial resources to fight a man with my vast wealth and my heavy corporate connections?" He leaned in much closer, trying to physically intimidate me with his sheer size. "If you do not sign those divorce papers and fully waive your right to the financial settlement by tomorrow morning, I will unleash my entire corporate legal team on you. I will personally ensure you are tied up in brutal litigation for the next 10 years. I will completely bankrupt your pathetic little meal prep business. I will freeze your personal banking account so fast your head will spin. I will make sure you cannot afford to buy basic groceries, let alone hire a competent defense attorney. You will walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing, Kiara. Sign the papers, take the $2,000 my lawyer generously offered, and disappear from my city." I stared up at him intensely, studying the cruel, arrogant lines of his face. This was the exact man I had cooked for, cleaned for, and passionately supported when he was just a struggling broker making desperate cold calls from our tiny apartment bedroom. This was the man who had promised to fiercely love and protect me in front of our entire congregation. Now he was ruthlessly threatening to destroy my entire life over a house he did not even legally own. I kept my facial expression completely blank, carefully masking the burning, chaotic fire of the legal arsenal sitting just a few feet away in my dark pantry. Vanessa sauntered back into the kitchen, looking thoroughly bored by the entire house tour. "The upstairs layout is completely chaotic." "DeAndre," she complained casually, brushing a microscopic speck of dust off her pristine designer sleeve. "The master bedroom is painfully tiny, and the guest room literally smells like sickness and death. We are going to have to rip up all the carpets and repaint every single wall before we even think about bringing high-end luxury buyers through here." She walked confidently over to DeAndre and placed her hand affectionately on his arm, a gesture far too intimate for a simple real estate broker. As she reached out, the bright fluorescent kitchen lights caught a massive flashing stone on her right hand. My eyes locked onto the ring instantly, my heart skipping a painful beat. It was a large square-cut emerald surrounded by a thick halo of small, flawless diamonds. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. It was not just any piece of expensive jewelry. It was Miss Ruby's vintage emerald ring. The exact ring her late husband had specially designed and given her for their 30th wedding anniversary. The ring that had mysteriously gone missing from Miss Ruby's wooden jewelry box 2 weeks before she died, while I was desperately searching the entire house for it because she wanted to hold it one last time to feel close to her husband. DeAndre had stolen his dying mother's most cherished sentimental possession right out of her bedroom and given it directly to his mistress. The sheer absolute depravity of his actions washed over me in a cold wave, solidifying my internal resolve into unbreakable, frozen steel. Any lingering microscopic shred of guilt I felt about destroying his life completely vanished into thin air in that exact second. I looked away from the stolen emerald ring and lowered my eyes to the floor, deliberately slumping my shoulders forward to project total, crushing defeat. "You win, DeAndre," I whispered softly, making my voice sound shaky, frightened and completely broken. "I do not have the money to fight your corporate lawyers. I am just so tired of fighting everybody." DeAndre smiled, a massive, triumphant grin spreading widely across his handsome face. He patted my shoulder in a fake, sickeningly patronizing gesture of comfort. "That is a very smart decision, Kiara," he said smugly, adjusting his expensive tie. "I knew you would eventually see logic and reason. Vanessa and I have a very important, highly exclusive corporate gala to attend this evening to officially announce the massive Midtown project to our major investors. I will have my lawyer email you the final divorce agreement tonight. Sign it, leave the keys on the kitchen counter, and be gone by tomorrow afternoon." Vanessa gave me a final, intensely pitying look, grabbed DeAndre's arm possessively, and led him out the front door. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, listening to the heavy engine of their luxury sedan roar to life and fade away quickly down the street. I slowly raised my head, staring at the empty driveway with cold, calculated eyes. They thought I was a broken, helpless woman surrendering blindly to their immense power. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the exact motivation I needed to execute them publicly. The illusion of my surrender did not buy me peace. It bought them the confidence to launch a full-scale coordinated attack on every single aspect of my life. It started the very next morning before the sun even fully cleared the horizon. I was standing in my commercial prep kitchen, surrounded by hundreds of dollars of fresh organic produce, wild-caught salmon, and premium ingredients I had purchased to fulfill a massive corporate luncheon contract. My business phone began to ring sharply. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered with my standard professional greeting. On the other end was Mr. Caldwell, the operations director for a rapidly growing tech startup downtown. He had been my most loyal client for 3 years, but this morning his voice was thick with deep discomfort and nervous hesitation. "Kiara." He started clearing his throat awkwardly. "I am calling to cancel the catering contract for the quarterly review today. In fact, we need to completely terminate our vendor relationship moving forward." I stood perfectly still, a cold knot forming instantly in my stomach. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite, but pressing for answers. "Is there an issue with the menu or the pricing? We have worked together seamlessly for years." There was a long, heavy pause on the line. "Listen, Kiara," he finally whispered, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear him. "I really love your food, and you are a wonderful person. But Apex Holdings just aggressively bought out the commercial lease for our entire office building. Their new senior leasing manager, a woman named Vanessa, contacted our executive board first thing this morning. She made it explicitly clear that our upcoming lease renewal negotiations would be heavily influenced by our willingness to switch to their exclusive list of preferred corporate vendors. I cannot risk my company's headquarters over a catering contract. I am truly sorry." The line went dead. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, the sheer maliciousness of their strategy sinking in. DeAndre and Vanessa were not just waiting for me to sign the divorce papers, they were actively using his immense corporate power to permanently destroy my livelihood. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was a downtown law firm. Cancelled. Then an accounting agency. Cancelled. By noon, I had received 6 phone calls and 4 urgent emails. Every single one of my major corporate clients severed ties with me in a span of 4 hours. Vanessa was likely sitting in the lavish $1 million Buckhead mansion DeAndre bought with his mother's stolen money, casually sipping expensive coffee while she systematically dismantled the business I had built with my bare hands. I sat down heavily on a metal prep stool, forced to log into my business banking portal to issue thousands of dollars in immediate deposit refunds for the canceled events. I watched my projected quarterly income drop from a comfortable profit margin to absolutely zero in a matter of keystrokes. But DeAndre did not stop at destroying my finances. He wanted to ensure I was entirely isolated, stripped of any emotional support or community standing. As I sat in the quiet kitchen, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently, buzzing uncontrollably across the stainless steel counter. The screen lit up with dozens of rapid-fire text messages and social media notifications. I picked it up with a trembling hand and opened a message from an older woman who sat in the pew directly behind me at church every Sunday. The text simply read, "You are a deeply wicked woman. How could you torture a dying elder like that? You should be in federal prison." Completely terrified and confused, I immediately opened my social media applications. My entire feed was flooded with a live video broadcast that Chantel had posted to her public page an hour earlier. She was sitting on a plush velvet sofa in her expensive living room wearing dark, somber clothing. Mascara ran heavily down her cheeks as she sobbed uncontrollably into a tissue. Jamal sat closely beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, looking fiercely angry at the camera. I tapped the screen to play the audio, and Chantel's tearful, highly dramatic voice filled my kitchen. "I did not want to bring our private family pain to the public," Chantel cried loudly, looking directly into the camera lens. "But the community needs to know the absolute truth about my sister-in-law, Kiara." While my amazing brother DeAndre was working tirelessly overseas to afford the best medical care for our mother, Kiara was supposed to be her primary caregiver. But she locked my helpless dying mother in a dark bedroom. She cruelly withheld her prescribed pain medication out of pure spite and greed. She starved her, forcing my brother to drop his international business deals and rush home just to feed his own mother ice chips. She physically and emotionally abused a saint of a woman, and now she is trying to extort my grieving brother for millions of dollars in a bitter divorce. The lies were so incredibly massive, so perfectly calculated to trigger absolute outrage in our close-knit community that I could barely breathe. I scrolled down with a shaking finger to look at the comments section. The video already had hundreds of shares and thousands of brutal, unforgiving comments. People I had known for years, people I had personally cooked for at the repast just yesterday, were calling for my immediate arrest. Members of our extended family were leaving long, hateful paragraphs calling me a gold-digging monster and a disgrace to the community. My phone buzzed again with a harsh email alert. It was a formal message from the church administration board, coldly informing me that I was no longer welcome to participate in the women's ministry, and strongly suggesting I seek deep psychological counseling before attempting to step foot on church grounds again. The social assassination was swift, absolute, and utterly devastating. DeAndre knew exactly how our community operated. He knew that the loud, tearful narrative of the wealthy, grieving family would completely overshadow the quiet, exhausted truth of the wife who actually did the grueling work. He was building a massive, impenetrable wall of public hatred around me. He wanted to ensure that when I was finally thrown out of the house, I would have no money, no business, no friends, no church family, and absolutely nowhere to turn for help. He wanted me completely broken, begging on my knees for whatever tiny scraps he generously decided to throw my way. I dropped my phone onto the counter and walked slowly back into the main house. The deep, heavy silence of the empty rooms felt entirely different now. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a massive, beautifully decorated prison cell. I walked into the kitchen and opened my banking application on my laptop one final time. After the massive wave of forced corporate refunds and the automatic withdrawals for the monthly utility bills, my business account showed a negative balance. My personal savings account, which I had consistently drained to buy premium groceries and medical supplies for Miss Ruby when DeAndre claimed he was broke, held exactly $34.50. I was financially paralyzed. I was socially exiled. I was entirely alone. I leaned heavily against the cold granite island, the sheer crushing weight of their coordinated cruelty pushing me dangerously close to a total mental collapse. A deep, agonizing sob built up in the back of my throat, threatening to tear out of me. I closed my eyes tightly, and a single bitter tear escaped, sliding hotly down my cheek. I had sacrificed 5 years of my youth, my ambition, and my heart to this family, only to be discarded and framed as a villain by the very monsters who actually committed the crimes. But as I opened my eyes and wiped the tear away, my gaze fell directly onto the heavy wooden doors of the walk-in pantry. The sorrow vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden violent surge of adrenaline. I marched across the kitchen, opened the pantry doors, and reached up to the highest shelf. I pulled down the heavy leather binder and the rusted metal lockbox. I placed them firmly on the kitchen island, opened the creaky metal lid, and took out the faded cream-colored stationery. I smoothed the paper out flat against the granite and traced my fingers over Miss Ruby's shaky, jagged handwriting. "He stole my life. Take his." I read the words out loud to the empty kitchen, my voice completely steady and void of any remaining fear. The raw, desperate truth in her final message acted like a harsh electric shock to my nervous system, instantly burning away the lingering despair. DeAndre thought he could starve me out by cutting off my catering contracts. He thought he could silence me by turning our community blindly against me. He believed his own arrogant illusion that he was the smartest, most powerful person in the city. His fatal flaw was assuming that because I wore a catering apron, I was entirely ignorant of corporate warfare. He assumed his dying mother was just a helpless, senile old woman who knew absolutely nothing about his massive financial crimes. I carefully folded the handwritten note and placed it back securely into the rusted box. I opened the thick leather binder, flipping past the GPS logs of Vanessa's mansion and the sickening bank statements showing the theft of the cancer funds. I turned to the final section where Miss Ruby had meticulously filed the legal contact information for the architect of her shadow trust. The name printed boldly on the heavy cardstock was Reginald Sterling, Senior Partner, at one of the most ruthless, feared corporate litigation firms in the state of Georgia. I picked up my phone, completely ignoring the endless stream of hateful text messages and threatening voicemails from Chantel's loyal internet mob. I dialed the number listed on the card. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to stop pretending to be the weak, defeated wife they so desperately wanted me to be. DeAndre wanted to bury me in endless legal fees and public humiliation. I was going to use his own mother's hidden arsenal to burn his entire billion-dollar empire straight to the ground, and I was going to make absolutely sure Vanessa and Chantel went down with the burning ship. The line rang exactly 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Reginald Sterling speaking. The voice barked, sounding highly irritated by the unexpected interruption. I took a deep, steadying breath, gripping the edge of my granite kitchen counter. "Mr. Sterling, my name is Kiara," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am Miss Ruby's daughter-in-law. She left me a rusted metal box, a heavy brass key, and a black data drive. She told me to call you when the war started." There was a heavy loaded silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic in the background. Then a sharp, approving sigh came through the speaker. "I have been waiting for your call for 3 weeks, Kiara," he said, his tone shifting instantly from irritated to sharply focused. "My office is in the Bank of America Plaza downtown. You have exactly 45 minutes to get here. Bring every single piece of paper she left you." I grabbed the heavy leather binder, locked my house, and drove straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. Mr. Sterling's law firm occupied the entire 50th floor of the towering glass skyscraper. Walking into his massive corner office felt like stepping into a fortress of absolute corporate power. The walls were lined with thick, leather-bound legal volumes, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, unobstructed view of the entire city skyline. Reginald Sterling sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He was a distinguished older black man with sharp, assessing eyes and a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He did not offer me a warm smile or a cup of coffee. He pointed a silver pen directly at the leather chair across from him. "Sit down," he commanded. I placed the thick binder carefully on his desk and took a seat. He leaned back, steepling his fingers together. "Before I look at whatever you brought me, we need to get one thing completely straight, Kiara. Your mother-in-law was a brilliant, highly formidable woman. We spent the last 9 months meticulously building a legal guillotine meant for her son. But DeAndre is a very powerful, highly connected man in this city. He has deep pockets and vicious corporate lawyers. I need to know right now if you actually have the stomach to drop the blade on him, or if you are going to back down and cry the second things get ugly. I do not waste my time representing weak people. I looked him dead in the eye, feeling the cold, hard steel that had completely replaced my broken heart. My husband abandoned his dying mother, I said evenly. He stole her cancer treatment money to buy $1 million mansion for his mistress. He is actively trying to throw me onto the street, and this morning he systematically contacted every single one of my corporate clients to completely bankrupt my small business. I do not have a single shred of mercy left for that man. I want to burn his entire empire to the ground. Mr. Sterling studied my face for a long, quiet moment. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Good, he said simply. Open the binder. Let us see what you have. For the next 2 hours, the massive office was completely silent, except for the crisp rustle of heavy paper and the rapid clicking of Mr. Sterling's computer mouse as he plugged in the black USB drive. He reviewed the private investigator logs, the GPS tracking data, and the sickening bank statements showing DeAndre draining the medical accounts. He read through the property lien assignment I had retrieved from the bank vault earlier that morning. When he finally finished, he leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a low, impressed whistle. You already have enough evidence right here to send DeAndre to federal prison for elder financial abuse and massive wire fraud, Mr. Sterling said, tapping the printed bank statements. But sending him to jail is entirely too easy. Miss Ruby did not just want to lock him up. She wanted to completely strip him of the one thing he loves more than anything else in this world: his absolute corporate power. He turned his large computer monitor around, so it faced me directly. On the screen was a massive high-resolution, architectural rendering of a towering, ultra-modern glass skyscraper. It was the exact building DeAndre had been aggressively bragging about. The billion-dollar Midtown Commercial Development Project, Apex Holdings' crowning achievement. DeAndre has spent the last 3 years securing massive international investments to fund the construction of this specific skyscraper, Mr. Sterling explained methodically, pointing to the glowing rendering. It is the absolute foundation of his entire corporate empire. He convinced a massive board of wealthy investors to give him hundreds of millions of dollars to build it. But in the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, owning the physical glass and steel building means absolutely nothing if you do not legally own the dirt underneath it. I leaned forward, my brow furrowing in deep concentration. I do not understand, I said. DeAndre told everyone he bought that prime Midtown land outright from the city. Mr. Sterling let out a sharp, mocking laugh. That is what he desperately wants everyone to believe. The truth is that specific plot of land in Midtown has been privately owned by a deeply secretive shell corporation for decades. When DeAndre needed the land to build his legacy project, the shell corporation absolutely refused to sell it to him. Instead, they forced him to sign an ironclad 99-year commercial ground lease. He pays them a massive fortune every single month just for the right to let his building sit on their dirt. My heart began to beat a rapid, heavy rhythm against my ribs as the pieces slowly started clicking together. Who owns the Shell Corporation? I asked, my voice dropping to a breathless whisper. Mr. Sterling smiled, a predatory, victorious look gleaming brightly in his eyes. He opened a heavily encrypted file from the USB drive and pulled up a complex corporate registration document. Your mother-in-law was a very wealthy, highly secretive woman long before her health failed Kiara. She bought that empty dirt lot 30 years ago for pennies on the dollar. Miss Ruby owned the Shell Corporation. Miss Ruby was DeAndre's secret landlord the entire time. He built his billion-dollar empire directly on his mother's property without ever knowing her true identity. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit me like a physical shockwave. Miss Ruby had held the ultimate trump card her entire life. She had literally owned the ground her arrogant son walked on. But as I stared at the documents, a sudden realization made me sit back in my chair. But she is gone now, I said quietly. Does the ground lease automatically transfer to DeAndre since he is her biological son? Absolutely not, Mr. Sterling replied sharply, slamming his hand flat on the mahogany desk. That brings us to the ultimate trap she built for him. 9 months ago, when DeAndre first started stealing her cancer funds, Miss Ruby came to this exact office. We established a highly secure, irrevocable trust. She transferred the total ownership of the Midtown land, the Shell Corporation, and the ground lease entirely into that trust, and she named you, Kiara, as the sole undisputed trustee and primary beneficiary. You are the shadow landlord now. You own the dirt under his billion-dollar skyscraper. I stared at my own name printed boldly in black ink on the official legal trust documents. The power radiating from those pages was absolutely staggering. But how does this help me destroy his company, I asked, looking up at the ruthless attorney. He still has a 99-year lease. As long as he pays the monthly rent, I cannot legally touch his building. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes shining with cold, calculated brilliance. That is exactly where his massive financial crimes come into play. A standard commercial ground lease is practically unbreakable. But I drafted this specific lease personally. I included a very strict, highly explicit morality and fraud clause. It clearly states that if the tenant company Apex Holdings or its primary executive officer, DeAndre, is ever found guilty of committing severe financial fraud, wire fraud, or felony embezzlement, the lease is instantly null and void. The landlord has the absolute right to legally terminate the agreement and immediately evict the entire corporation from the premises. A sharp electric thrill shot straight down my spine. I looked down at the massive stack of bank statements proving DeAndre had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from a dying woman. The evidence of his massive felony fraud was sitting right in front of me. Exactly, Mr. Sterling said, reading the sudden realization on my face. DeAndre triggered the fraud clause the very first time he wired his mother's stolen cancer money into his corporate accounts. The legal trap is perfectly set. The guillotine is raised. All we have to do now is pick the exact perfect moment to drop the blade and cut his head completely off. I thought about the canceled catering contracts. I thought about the vicious, hateful social media video Chantel had posted to destroy my reputation. I thought about Vanessa casually walking through my home, wearing Miss Ruby's stolen emerald ring. I looked up at Mr. Sterling, my mind suddenly locking onto the perfect stage for our absolute revenge. Tomorrow night, I said. Tomorrow. My voice ringing with absolute certainty. DeAndre and Vanessa are hosting a massive, highly exclusive corporate gala at the Midtown property to officially announce the new development to all of their major investors. The entire board of directors will be there. The local business media will be there. He wants to use that exact stage to publicly humiliate me and force me to sign his divorce papers in front of his wealthy friends. Mr. Sterling's predatory smile grew even wider. He picked up his silver pen and began writing rapidly on a fresh yellow legal pad. A public execution, he mused softly. It is incredibly risky, highly dramatic, and absolutely perfect. I will immediately draft the formal eviction notices and prepare the legal injunctions to freeze his corporate assets. I will also make a very quiet off-the-record phone call to a contact of mine at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They take elder financial abuse and wire fraud very seriously. He slid a heavy embossed business card across the desk. Go buy yourself the most expensive, powerful dress you can find, Kiara. Tomorrow night, you are not walking into that gala as a defeated, broken caterer. You are walking in as the undisputed owner of the building, and we are going to burn his entire life to ashes. I left Mr. Sterling's office feeling a strange, intoxicating mix of profound clarity and dangerous anticipation. The chaotic, terrifying storm that had been raging inside my mind for the past 48 hours had finally settled into a cold, hyper-focused calm. I drove back to my quiet suburban house, the physical weight of the heavy leather binder resting on the passenger seat serving as a constant, comforting reminder of the absolute power I now held. When I pulled into my driveway, a sleek black delivery van was idling by the curb. A courier dressed in a sharp gray uniform was walking up my front steps, holding a thick, glossy black envelope sealed with a prominent silver wax stamp. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching loudly under my shoes, and met him on the porch. He asked for my signature, handed over the heavy envelope without making eye contact, and quickly drove away. I went inside, locked the heavy deadbolt behind me, and carried the envelope into the kitchen. The wax seal bore the distinct stylized logo of Apex Holdings. I slid a sharp paring knife under the flap and pulled out a heavy piece of custom embossed cardstock. It was a VIP invitation to the Midtown Project Announcement Gala, hosted by DeAndre and his executive board. The event was scheduled for tomorrow evening at the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel, mere blocks from the massive construction site of the new skyscraper. But it was not the formal printed text that caught my attention. It was a small handwritten note attached to the back of the card with a gold paperclip. The elegant sweeping cursive belonged to Vanessa. I read her vicious words carefully, my eyes narrowing at her sheer audacity. Kiara, we decided to be generous and grant you access to the venue. Come to the service entrance at the back of the hotel near the loading dock. We will leave a cheap pen and the final divorce agreement at the staff catering table for you to sign. Do not try to mingle with the actual guests or eat the expensive food. Just sign the legal papers, take your little settlement check, and disappear, so DeAndre and I can celebrate our incredible future without your depressing presence dragging us down. A cold, genuine smile touched my lips. Their staggering arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. They honestly believed I was a broken, defeated woman who would obediently sneak through the back door and sign away my dignity, just to escape their relentless torment. They wanted me to witness their absolute triumph. They wanted me to see DeAndre standing on a massive stage, bathed in expensive lighting, celebrated by the wealthiest investors in the city, while Vanessa stood proudly by his side, wearing my mother-in-law's stolen emerald ring. They wanted to crush my spirit completely in front of the local media. They had no idea they were formally inviting the executioner directly to their own public beheading. But executing a plan of this massive magnitude required physical resources I currently did not have. DeAndre and Vanessa had successfully frozen my business accounts and completely drained my personal savings, leaving me with exactly $34 to my name. Mr. Sterling had told me to buy the most expensive, powerful outfit I could find, but high-end designer clothing required serious capital. I looked out the kitchen window at the large commercial catering van parked proudly in my driveway. I had bought that van brand new 3 years ago, after saving every single penny from my first major corporate contracts. It was the physical embodiment of my hard work, my culinary dreams, and my complete financial independence. It physically hurt my chest to let it go, but I knew I had to sacrifice the remnants of my old life to fully fund the total destruction of theirs. I grabbed the keys, drove the heavy van straight to a large commercial dealership on the outskirts of Atlanta, and walked confidently into the manager's office. I did not waste time haggling over minor details or Kelley Blue Book values. I told him I needed to sell the vehicle immediately for cold hard cash today. He thoroughly inspected the pristine interior, noted the incredibly low mileage, and offered me $12,000 on the spot. It was thousands less than it was actually worth, but I did not care about the loss. I aggressively signed the title over, took the thick white envelope full of crisp $100 bills, and called a premium luxury rideshare service. I directed the driver to Buckhead, the exact same ultra-wealthy neighborhood where Vanessa lived in the sprawling mansion funded entirely by Miss Ruby's stolen medical money. I walked into the most exclusive, intimidating luxury boutique on the main avenue. The moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors, the impeccably dressed sales associates looked at my casual jeans and exhausted face with barely concealed disdain. They clearly assumed I was lost or looking for a public restroom. I ignored their harsh, judgmental stares, walked directly up to the senior stylist, and handed her a thick stack of $100 bills from the envelope. I told her I had a highly publicized corporate gala to attend tomorrow night, and I needed an outfit that commanded absolute authority, wealth, and unapologetic power. Cold, hard cash instantly changed their entire attitude. For the next 3 hours, I was treated like absolute royalty. I tried on dozens of high-end garments until I found the exact perfect piece. It was a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald green power suit with a sharp plunging neckline and a structured commanding silhouette. The rich color was entirely intentional, a subtle sharp nod to the stolen emerald ring Vanessa loved to flaunt. I paired the suit with sky-high black stiletto heels that made a sharp authoritative clicking sound on the marble floor. I purchased professional high-grade makeup and sleek, elegant jewelry that looked sophisticated but completely uncompromising. When the stylist finally packed my purchases into heavy designer garment bags, I had spent over $4,000. It was a massive, terrifying sum of money, but as I walked out of the boutique, I did not feel an ounce of regret. I was investing directly in my own ultimate victory. I kept the rest of the cash safely secured in my leather purse. I still had one more critical, highly secretive investment to make before the gala actually began. I needed to ensure the primary audiovisual technician working the event was completely loyal to me, and I knew a thick envelope of $100 bills was the absolute best way to secure his undivided cooperation. The next 24 hours passed in a complete blur of intense, meticulous preparation. I returned home and cleared off my entire dining room table, laying out every single piece of explosive evidence, like a military general mapping out a chaotic battlefield. I took the heavily watermarked documents Mr. Sterling had rapidly drafted for me, the formal commercial eviction notice, the asset freezing injunctions, and the certified copies of the irrevocable trust, proving my total ownership of the Midtown land, and organized them perfectly into a sleek black leather portfolio. I placed the black USB drive containing Miss Ruby's final recorded video message securely in the front zippered pocket of the portfolio. This was my heavy artillery, the weapon that would finally bring a corrupt billionaire crashing down to his knees. When the sun finally began to set over Atlanta, casting long, dark shadows across the quiet suburban street, I carried my designer garment bags upstairs to the master bathroom. I stood under the scalding hot shower until my skin turned pink, deliberately washing away the lingering smell of the catering kitchen, the harsh hospital antiseptics, and the deep, heavy grief of the past 9 months. I spent an entire hour meticulously applying my expensive new makeup, highlighting the sharp, fierce angles of my cheekbones, and painting my lips a deep, confident shade of crimson red. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style that left my face completely exposed and unapologetic. I slipped into the emerald green power suit and stepped into the black stiletto heels. I walked slowly over to the full-length mirror standing in the corner of the bedroom and stared deeply at my own reflection. The woman looking back at me was a complete stranger. The exhausted, terrified, submissive wife who had cried helplessly on the kitchen floor just a few days ago was entirely dead and buried. The powerful woman standing in the mirror was cold, calculating, and dangerously fearless. She was a woman who held the absolute legal right to destroy a massive corporate empire. She was a woman who was going to honor Miss Ruby's dying wish with absolute, brutal precision. I picked up the heavy black leather portfolio, checked my gold watch to ensure I was perfectly on schedule, and walked out of the bedroom without looking back. It was time to attend the grand gala. It was time for the shadow landlord to formally introduce herself to the tenants. The premium black car service pulled smoothly up to the grand entrance of the downtown luxury hotel. Through the tinted windows, I could see the chaotic, brilliant flash of press cameras illuminating the warm Atlanta night. DeAndre had spared absolutely no expense for his massive Midtown project announcement. A long, plush red carpet stretched from the valet station all the way through the heavy revolving glass doors. Valets in crisp white uniforms scrambled to open the doors of arriving luxury vehicles, ushering in the absolute highest tier of the city's wealthy corporate elite. I took a deep breath, smoothing the crisp fabric of my emerald green power suit. I checked the heavy black leather portfolio resting firmly on my lap, feeling the solid shape of the encrypted USB drive hidden securely in the front pocket. I did not feel nervous. I felt a cold, sharp anticipation. The driver opened my door, offering his white-gloved hand. I stepped out onto the red carpet, the sharp click of my stiletto heels cutting clearly through the ambient noise of the crowd. I bypassed the eager local business reporters, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. I walked into the grand lobby, following the elegant gold signage, directing guests toward the main ballroom. The sheer opulence of the event was staggering. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the room. A live string quartet played classical music softly in the corner, while waiters in sharp black tuxedos circulated through the dense crowd, carrying towering silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Everyone who was anyone in the Atlanta commercial real estate market was currently standing in this room. I handed my coat to the attendant at the cloakroom and stepped fully into the ballroom. The vibrant emerald green of my tailored suit stood out sharply against the sea of muted black tuxedos and safe conservative evening gowns. Almost immediately, heads began to turn. Conversations trailed off into confused, urgent whispers as people recognized my face. Many of these wealthy investors and socialites went to my church or followed Chantel on social media. They had watched her vicious, tearful video. They fully expected me to be hiding in shame, utterly destroyed by the accusations of elder abuse and the impending divorce. They certainly did not expect me to walk through the front doors of a billion-dollar corporate gala looking like I owned the entire city. I ignored their intense, judgmental stares and made my way deliberately toward the front of the room. A thick crimson velvet rope blocked off a highly exclusive VIP section reserved specifically for DeAndre's executive board and his inner circle of wealthy family members. Standing right at the edge of the velvet rope holding a crystal glass of bourbon was Jamal. He spotted me approaching and his eyes widened in absolute shock. He aggressively nudged Chantel, who was standing right next to him wearing a highly inappropriate, deeply plunging silver dress. Chantel turned around, her jaw dropping open as she took in my immaculate appearance. Her shock quickly morphed into intense, deeply irrational anger. She shoved past a group of older investors marching aggressively toward me, with Jamal trailing closely behind her like an obedient guard dog. "What in the world are you doing out here?" Chantel hissed violently, keeping her voice low but completely laced with venom. "You are not allowed to be in the main ballroom. The invitation explicitly said you were supposed to go through the filthy loading dock in the back. Security is waiting for you at the staff catering table by the kitchen doors." I stopped walking, planting my heels firmly on the plush carpet. I looked Chantel slowly up and down, letting my eyes linger critically on her cheap-looking silver dress. "I am not a member of the catering staff tonight," Chantel, I replied evenly, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I am an invited guest." "You are an absolute embarrassment," Jamal chimed in, stepping forward to try and physically intimidate me with his broad shoulders. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face in public after the horrible things you did to my mother-in-law. Everyone in this entire room knows exactly what kind of gold-digging monster you are. If you do not turn around and walk out those front doors right now, I will personally grab you by the arm and drag you out into the street. My brother-in-law is about to make the biggest financial announcement of his life, and we are not going to let a bitter, bankrupt ex-wife ruin his perfect evening." Before I could firmly put Jamal in his place, the dense crowd of investors suddenly parted. Vanessa glided smoothly into our tense circle, looking like the absolute queen of the corporate ball. She wore a stunning floor-length black sequin gown that clung tightly to her tall frame, and her hair was swept up into an intricate, flawless style. She stepped gracefully in front of Chantel and Jamal, holding a flute of expensive pink champagne. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet, deeply condescending smile that was entirely designed for the wealthy audience currently watching our interaction. "Kiara, darling." Vanessa projected loudly, ensuring her clear voice carried over the soft music to the surrounding circle of heavy investors. I am honestly so shocked you actually gathered the courage to show up tonight. I specifically told the security team to leave a cheap plastic pen by the dumpsters out back so you could sign the divorce settlement without embarrassing yourself in front of DeAndre's important colleagues. She took a slow, dramatic sip of her champagne, her dark eyes scanning my emerald green suit with calculated mockery. But I must say, I am incredibly impressed you managed to scrape together your last few pennies to buy that suit. It is a very cute, desperate attempt to look successful. Did you have to pawn your little catering pots and pans to afford it? Because I heard through the corporate grapevine that your entire business went completely bankrupt this morning. It is such a tragedy when small, insignificant businesses fail because they simply cannot compete in the major leagues. A few of the older, wealthy investors standing nearby chuckled softly at her cruel public humiliation. Chantel smirked proudly, crossing her arms over her chest, clearly thrilled that Vanessa was tearing me apart in front of the city's elite. DeAndre was nowhere to be seen, likely backstage preparing for his massive keynote speech, leaving Vanessa to fiercely guard his territory and establish her permanent dominance as the new woman in his life. She wanted to completely break my spirit before I even had the chance to read the divorce papers. She wanted to establish her absolute superiority. To drive the final nail into the coffin, Vanessa casually lifted her right hand to brush a loose strand of hair away from her face. As she moved, the bright sparkling light from the massive crystal chandeliers above caught the massive square-cut emerald ring sitting prominently on her finger. She purposely kept her hand elevated near her collarbone, flashing the stolen jewelry directly in my face. DeAndre has such incredibly exquisite taste in fine jewelry. Vanessa sighed dramatically, rubbing her thumb affectionately over the brilliant green stone. He always says a truly successful man needs to richly spoil the woman who actually supports his massive vision. It takes a very special kind of woman to stand beside a billionaire. It is a heavy burden, but I am more than happy to carry it for him. It is just a shame you never quite figured out how to be anything more than a glorified housemaid. The silence that followed her brutal insult was heavy and suffocating. The surrounding guests waited eagerly for my reaction. They expected me to burst into humiliated tears. They expected me to turn around and run out of the ballroom in total disgrace. They expected a chaotic, loud, embarrassing scene from a desperate, broken woman. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I stood completely still, letting the absolute silence stretch out for several long, deeply uncomfortable seconds. I slowly lifted my hand and signaled a passing waiter dressed in a black tuxedo. He immediately stopped holding out his silver tray. I carefully picked up a crystal flute of champagne, turned back to face Vanessa, and took a slow, elegant sip. The cold liquid coated my dry throat. I smiled. It was not a forced, nervous smile. It was a warm, completely genuine, terrifyingly calm smile. I took one single deliberate step closer into Vanessa's personal space. I leaned in very close to her ear, but I kept my vocal tone sharp and just loud enough for the eager eavesdropping investors standing in the immediate circle to hear every single word clearly. "It is a truly beautiful stone, Vanessa," I said, my voice smooth and icy cold. "The vintage emerald cut is completely flawless. But I really hope you kept the official purchase receipt for that exact ring." Vanessa frowned, her smug expression faltering slightly in pure confusion. "What are you talking about?" she asked sharply, dropping her hand back down to her side. Federal asset seizure is a very ugly, incredibly complicated legal process. I continued calmly, taking another delicate sip of my champagne. When the authorities discover a piece of high-end jewelry was purchased with stolen funds, they do not just politely ask for it back. They forcefully confiscate it. And it would be an absolute crying shame for a highly respected luxury real estate broker like yourself to catch a federal felony charge for knowingly receiving stolen property across state lines. The blood instantly drained from Vanessa's perfectly contoured face. Her jaw went completely slack, and the confident, mocking light in her dark eyes vanished, replaced immediately by a sudden, intense flash of absolute panic. She stared at me, her mind clearly racing to comprehend how I could possibly know the dark illegal origins of her lavish lifestyle. Chantel and Jamal looked completely baffled, entirely unaware of the massive financial crimes DeAndre had committed behind their backs to fund his mistress. I did not give Vanessa a single second to recover her composure or formulate a lie. I stepped back, adjusting the grip on my heavy black leather portfolio. I gave her one final, chillingly polite nod. "Excuse me," I said smoothly, my voice ringing with total authority. "I need to find my seat. The main presentation is about to begin, and as a major stakeholder in this property, I prefer to sit directly in the front row." I walked right past her frozen, trembling figure. I unhooked the heavy crimson velvet rope myself, completely ignoring Jamal's weak, confused protests. I strode confidently into the highly restricted VIP section and took a seat in the very center of the front row, directly facing the massive stage. I placed the leather portfolio neatly on my lap, crossed my legs, and waited patiently for the curtains to open. The absolute destruction of Apex Holdings was officially underway. I sat in the plush velvet chair, the heavy leather portfolio resting like a loaded weapon on my lap. The immediate area around me in the VIP section buzzed with frantic, hushed whispers. To my left, senior banking executives leaned close, their eyes darting constantly in my direction. They had clearly expected a broken, weeping woman based on the vicious rumors circulating through the corporate grapevine. Instead, they were looking at a woman radiating absolute, unapologetic power. A few moments later, Vanessa practically stumbled into the VIP seating area. The effortless, arrogant grace she had displayed just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. Her flawless complexion was visibly pale, and she kept anxiously rubbing her thumb over the massive emerald ring on her right hand, as if the precious stone had suddenly turned scorching hot. She grabbed Chantel by the arm, whispering frantically in her ear. Chantel looked over at me, her initial smugness replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. Jamal stood behind them, nervously adjusting his expensive silk tie, completely unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in the evening's power dynamic. They were starting to realize that my presence was not a desperate plea for attention, but a calculated, deliberate invasion. I did not break my posture or acknowledge their panic. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead on the massive dark velvet curtains draping the main stage. The heavy, suffocating scent of expensive cologne and designer perfumes filled the warm air, mixing with the sharp tang of high-end champagne. Every single person in this grand ballroom was entirely driven by greed, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of corporate dominance. DeAndre had built his entire identity around impressing these exact people, and he was about to discover just how quickly they would abandon him when the money stopped flowing. Suddenly, the massive crystal chandeliers overhead dimmed slowly, casting the vast ballroom into expectant darkness. The live string quartet gracefully concluded their classical piece, and a deep, booming voice echoed powerfully over the state-of-the-art sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer proclaimed, his voice demanding absolute attention. "Please take your seats and direct your attention to the main stage. It is my honor to introduce the visionary architect of Atlanta's future, the CEO of Apex Holdings, DeAndre." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Wealthy investors, politicians, and corporate developers rose to their feet, clapping loudly for the man who promised to make them all substantially richer. I remained perfectly seated, my hands resting lightly on the black leather of my portfolio. I watched the heavy velvet curtains part smoothly in the center. Brilliant, blinding spotlights swept aggressively across the stage, illuminating the polished wooden floor and the sleek, modern podium set up in the center. The atmosphere was absolutely electric, charged with the intoxicating thrill of massive corporate wealth. DeAndre stepped out from the shadows and walked confidently toward the podium. He looked every inch the billionaire he desperately pretended to be. His tailored tuxedo fit flawlessly, and his charismatic smile flashed brightly in the stage lights. He raised his hands, gesturing for the crowd to take their seats. The applause slowly faded into a respectful, highly attentive silence. "Thank you." DeAndre began, his deep, resonant voice projecting perfectly across the massive ballroom. "We are gathered here tonight to officially unveil a project that will permanently alter the magnificent skyline of this great city. The Midtown Project is not just a billion-dollar commercial skyscraper. It is a bold, uncompromising statement of absolute economic dominance." He pressed a small remote in his hand, and the massive digital screens behind him flared to life, displaying a breathtaking high-resolution architectural rendering of a towering glass and steel monolith. The crowd murmured in genuine awe at the sheer scale and modern beauty of the proposed design. DeAndre spent the next 10 minutes masterfully working the room. He spoke passionately about job creation, international investment portfolios, and the aggressive expansion of his corporate empire. He was a natural, highly manipulative public speaker, effortlessly wrapping every single investor in the room around his finger. But then his tone suddenly shifted. He lowered the microphone slightly, letting his charismatic smile fade into a look of deep, profound sorrow. "As we celebrate this monumental achievement," he said softly, his voice echoing with perfectly calculated emotion, "I must take a moment to acknowledge the deep, personal loss my family recently suffered. As many of you know, my beloved mother, Miss Ruby, passed away just a few days ago." A collective, sympathetic sigh rippled through the wealthy audience. I watched him closely, my fingernails digging sharply into the leather of my portfolio. He was actually going to use the mother he neglected and robbed to score cheap sympathy points with his investors. "My mother was my greatest inspiration." DeAndre continued looking up at the ceiling as if holding back brave tears. "She was a woman of fierce integrity and relentless hard work. She sacrificed absolutely everything to ensure I had the opportunity to stand on this stage tonight. It is because of her unwavering support that Apex Holdings exists at all. I am officially dedicating the main lobby of the Midtown Project to her everlasting memory." The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of his words made my blood burn with a violent, freezing rage. While he was standing under bright lights praising her integrity, the dark, rusted lockbox sitting on my kitchen counter held the undeniable proof that he had systematically drained her life savings and denied her basic medical care. He was wearing a custom tuxedo paid for by her immense suffering. The crowd, entirely ignorant of the dark truth, burst into another round of loud, supportive applause. DeAndre nodded graciously, soaking in their unearned admiration. He was the perfect grieving son. He was the brilliant, benevolent CEO. He was standing at the absolute peak of his massive mountain of lies, completely unaware that the ground beneath his expensive shoes was about to crack wide open. He wiped a fake, invisible tear from his eye and seamlessly transitioned back to his corporate pitch. "The future of Apex Holdings is brighter than it has ever been," he declared proudly, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "We have secured the land, we have secured the massive international funding, and we are ready to break ground immediately." As DeAndre paused to let the applause wash over him again, his dark eyes began scanning the front rows of the VIP section. He was clearly looking for Vanessa, expecting to see his beautiful mistress gazing up at him with total adoration. Instead, his eyes locked directly onto me. I was sitting perfectly still in the dead center of the front row, the bright emerald green of my power suit standing out like a vibrant, undeniable warning sign in the dimly lit room. For a fraction of a second, his smooth, practiced composure completely shattered. He physically recoiled, his hand gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He had expected me to be hiding by the loading dock weeping over a cheap settlement check. Seeing me sitting proudly among his most powerful investors deeply unnerved him. But DeAndre was a master manipulator, and his recovery was dangerously fast. I watched his mind race behind his eyes as he rapidly calculated a new strategy. A cruel, predatory smile slowly replaced his momentary shock. He decided to use my unexpected presence to permanently assert his dominance and publicly humiliate me one final time. Before we conclude tonight's presentation, DeAndre announced smoothly, turning his full attention directly to me. I want to address a minor personal transition in my life. As we build for the future, we must sometimes cleanly sever the ties of the past. My soon-to-be ex-wife, Kiara, has unexpectedly joined us this evening. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the massive ballroom as thousands of eyes shifted instantly from the stage to my seated figure. I am a man who deeply believes in fairness and generosity. DeAndre continued, projecting his voice loudly so the local business reporters in the back could hear every single word. Even though our marriage is ending, I want to ensure she is comfortably taken care of. I have instructed my legal team to provide her with a highly generous financial settlement far beyond what is legally required. I invite Kiara to join me on stage right now to officially sign the final divorce agreement, proving to everyone here that Apex Holdings handles all of its liabilities with absolute grace and swift efficiency. A bright, blinding white spotlight suddenly snapped on, illuminating me completely in the dark room. He was publicly summoning me to surrender. I calmly uncrossed my legs, stood up, and gripped my black leather portfolio tightly. I did not look at Vanessa Chantel or Jamal. I kept my eyes locked fiercely on DeAndre. I stepped out of the VIP row and began the long, highly anticipated walk toward the massive stage. The long walk from the front row to the massive wooden stage felt like moving in slow motion. The sharp, authoritative click of my black stiletto heels echoed clearly against the silent anticipation of the room. Every eye was locked on me. I kept my chin held high, my posture rigidly straight, projecting an aura of completely unbroken strength. I reached the short flight of carpeted stairs leading up to the platform and ascended them smoothly, my emerald green power suit catching the bright glare of the overhead spotlights. DeAndre stood behind the sleek podium, holding a thick leather-bound folder containing the divorce settlement. He was watching me intently, his dark eyes analyzing my every movement, trying desperately to find a hint of the broken, terrified woman he expected. But I gave him absolutely nothing. My face was a completely blank mask of cold determination. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, planting my heels firmly on the wooden stage. The sheer size of the massive ballroom stretched out before me, filled with hundreds of wealthy, influential faces staring up in rapt attention. DeAndre cleared his throat loudly, leaning heavily into the microphone to project his deep, smooth voice across the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, turning slightly to gesture toward me with a sweep of his hand. "It takes a truly strong man to build a massive corporate empire, but it takes an even stronger man to admit when a personal partnership has run its natural course. Kiara and I have shared many years together, but as Apex Holdings moves into this bold new future, we must unfortunately part ways. However, I refuse to let the mother of my early struggles walk away empty-handed." He picked up the heavy leather folder and held it out toward me. He was playing the role of the benevolent, deeply generous billionaire perfectly. He wanted the investors to see him as a man of great character, a man who gracefully provided for a lesser woman even as he ascended to the absolute peak of corporate success. "Inside this folder is a highly generous financial settlement," DeAndre stated loudly, ensuring every single reporter in the back row recorded his magnanimous gesture. "I am personally offering Kiara a lump sum of $10,000 to help her relocate and start a new quiet life, away from the heavy pressures of the corporate world. It is far more than she legally deserves, considering she brought absolutely no assets into this marriage, but I believe in honoring the past before completely embracing the future." He pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from the inside pocket of his custom tuxedo jacket and held it out to me. The bright stage lights glinted off the polished metal. "Sign it, Kiara," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a subtle, heavy threat meant only for my ears. "Take the money, sign the papers right now, and walk off this stage before I completely destroy you." I looked down at the silver pen. I looked at the thick stack of legal documents inside the folder pages, explicitly designed to permanently sever me from my own home and leave me completely destitute. Then I slowly raised my eyes and looked out over the massive sea of expectant faces. I saw Chantel sitting in the VIP section, her hands clasped tightly together in eager anticipation. I saw Jamal leaning forward in his seat, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. And I saw Vanessa standing near the edge of the front row, nervously twisting the stolen emerald ring around her finger. They were all waiting for my absolute surrender. I reached out and slowly took the silver pen from DeAndre's hand. He let out a barely audible sigh of relief, his tense shoulders relaxing slightly. He honestly thought he had won. He thought his public display of wealth and power had successfully intimidated me into absolute submission. I stepped smoothly up to the podium, gently nudging DeAndre slightly to the side to command the microphone. The sudden movement caught him off guard, but he maintained his forced, pleasant smile for the crowd. I rested both of my hands firmly on the wooden podium, leaning into the microphone. "I will sign it. DeAndre," I said, my voice ringing out clearly and powerfully across the silent ballroom. The rich, amplified sound of my own voice startled a few of the investors in the front rows. "I will gladly sign these divorce papers and permanently end this marriage tonight." A collective murmur of approval rippled through the audience. DeAndre's smile grew wider, completely convinced his manipulative strategy had worked perfectly. But I continued deliberately raising my voice to cut sharply through the murmurs, demanding total, absolute silence. "Since we are standing on this stage tonight celebrating family values, and since you so eloquently dedicated the massive lobby of the Midtown Project to the everlasting memory of Miss Ruby, I think it is only fair that your major investors see exactly how this incredible legacy was actually funded." The entire ballroom went completely still. The comfortable, celebratory atmosphere instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden electric tension. DeAndre's triumphant smile completely froze on his face. He stared at me, his dark eyes widening in sudden raw panic. "What are you doing?" he hissed aggressively under his breath, stepping quickly toward the podium to try and grab the microphone away from me. I completely ignored him. I reached down and smoothly unzipped the front pocket of my black leather portfolio. I pulled out the sleek black USB drive and held it high in the air, the bright stage lights reflecting sharply off the modern casing. I turned my head and locked eyes directly with the senior audio-visual technician sitting in the raised control booth at the very back of the room, the man I had paid thousands of dollars in cold cash just hours earlier. I gave him a single sharp nod. "Let us take a very close look at the real foundation of Apex Holdings," I announced powerfully, my voice echoing like thunder across the grand ballroom. "Hit the screens now." The massive digital screens behind DeAndre instantly flickered, emitting a low, powerful electronic hum that reverberated through the floorboards. The beautiful, glowing architectural rendering of the Midtown Project completely vanished into the digital ether. In its place, two highly contrasted, deeply disturbing documents appeared side by side, projected at a massive scale for the entire ballroom to see. On the left side of the giant screen were Miss Ruby's official itemized hospital billing statements. I had the audio-visual technician highlight the most damning details in bright, unforgiving yellow. The audience could clearly read the hundreds of thousands of dollars in aggressively mounting medical debt. They saw the explicit denial letters for advanced life-extending chemotherapy treatments signed directly by DeAndre, acting as her financial proxy, citing a complete lack of available personal funds. On the right side of the screen, sitting in sickening juxtaposition to a dying woman's massive medical debt, was the certified, legally binding property deed for a sprawling luxury mansion in the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. The purchase price was listed at $1.2 million, paid entirely in cash. The name listed on the deed was not a corporate holding firm. It was Vanessa. I raised my hand and pointed a single finger directly at the massive screens. "Look very closely at the dates," I commanded, my voice booming through the silent room and echoing off the crystal chandeliers. The exact same week, my husband stood by his mother's hospital bed and told the oncologists we simply could not afford her life-saving cancer medication. He was aggressively wiring her liquidated retirement funds to purchase a luxury estate for his mistress. A collective horrified gasp echoed heavily through the ballroom. The wealthy investors who just minutes ago had been eagerly applauding DeAndre's deep family values were now staring at the undeniable proof of his absolute moral bankruptcy. DeAndre spun around violently, his dark eyes locking onto the glowing documents. His handsome face drained of all color in an instant, turning a sickly ashen gray. "Turn that off!" he screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he frantically waved his arms at the raised audio-visual booth at the back of the room. "Shut those screens down right now. I demand you cut the main power." But the technician I had paid thousands of dollars in cash simply crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and completely ignored the frantic corporate CEO. The undeniable evidence remained brightly projected, burning the cold truth permanently into the minds of every single major stakeholder in Apex Holdings. Vanessa covered her mouth with both hands, shrinking back into the dark shadows of the VIP section as the older conservative banking executives surrounding her glared with absolute unfiltered disgust. Chantel and Jamal looked completely paralyzed, their mouths hanging open as they finally realized the horrifying truth behind the lavish lifestyle they had blindly worshipped. But the projected documents were only the beginning of my heavy artillery. I turned back to the microphone, gripping the solid wooden edges of the podium so tightly my knuckles ached. "You do not have to simply take my word for it," I announced smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level to contrast with DeAndre's rising panic. Miss Ruby wanted to address the Apex Holdings executive board herself. I gave another sharp, predetermined nod toward the back of the room. The massive screens flickered once again. The unpaid medical bills and the luxury property deed dissolved quickly, replaced by a high-definition video file. The audio shifted seamlessly from my live microphone to the pre-recorded track. The grand ballroom was instantly filled with the heavy, labored breathing of a woman who was painfully close to death. The video showed Miss Ruby propped up against a mountain of white hospital pillows in the downstairs guest bedroom of my house. She looked incredibly frail, her skin pale, and her cheeks deeply sunken from the aggressive progression of the cancer. The clear plastic tubes of her oxygen cannula rested heavily across her face, but her dark eyes were piercing, entirely lucid, and burning with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "Hello, gentlemen of the board," Miss Ruby rasped, her voice weak, but carrying an undeniable commanding authority that demanded absolute silence from the wealthy crowd. "If you are watching this recording, it means my body has finally failed me, and my son DeAndre is currently standing on a stage attempting to use my memory to sell you a massive fraudulent lie. My son has always been a brilliant salesman, but he is a deeply corrupt, entirely fraudulent businessman." DeAndre stared up at the massive screen, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in a highly public nightmare he could not wake up from. For the past 9 months, Miss Ruby continued taking a slow, painful breath before forcing the heavy words out. "I have watched my son systematically drain my entire life savings. He liquidated my secure retirement portfolios and my late husband's life insurance policies. He did not do this to fund my necessary medical treatments. He did it because Apex Holdings is completely broke." The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs and furious whispers. Investors began aggressively leaning toward each other, their faces tight with sudden severe financial panic. "He has been lying to all of you," Miss Ruby declared, pointing a frail, trembling finger directly into the camera lens. "He completely over-leveraged his corporate accounts on his previous development deals. When the international funding for the Midtown project was slightly delayed, he faced total corporate bankruptcy, so he committed massive wire fraud. He forged my signature to illegally access my private accounts, stealing the money meant to ease my terrible physical pain, and injected it directly into Apex Holdings to artificially prop up his failing liquidity. He is using stolen fraudulent money to keep his empire afloat, and he bought his mistress a mansion just to stroke his own massive ego while his wife Kiara stayed awake for days to feed me by hand. He is a thief, a liar, and a complete disgrace to my family name." Do not trust him with your investments. Do not trust him with your city. The video ended abruptly, cutting to a stark, heavy black screen. The final echoing sound of Miss Ruby's labored breathing hung in the dead silence of the ballroom, like a heavy, inescapable curse. She had reached beyond the grave to personally dismantle the arrogant son who had callously left her to die. For 5 agonizing seconds, the grand ballroom was entirely silent, completely, shell-shocked by the devastating confession from the grave. Then absolute, uncontrollable chaos exploded. The carefully constructed illusion of DeAndre's corporate invincibility shattered into a million irreparable pieces. High-ranking banking executives and wealthy private investors immediately stood up from their plush velvet chairs, aggressively pulling their cell phones from their expensive tuxedo pockets. They were frantically dialing their senior legal counsel, screaming urgent panicked orders to freeze all pending wire transfers and instantly pull their financial backing from the Midtown project. The press reporters stationed in the back of the room went completely feral, their camera flashes strobing violently as they eagerly captured the absolute unprecedented destruction of a highly publicized billionaire. DeAndre finally snapped out of his paralyzed stupor as the reality of his ruined empire crashed down upon him. The sheer panic and blinding rage twisted his handsome face into something entirely monstrous. "You lying witch!" he roared, his voice completely raw, vicious, and unhinged. He aggressively shoved the heavy wooden podium aside, knocking the microphone to the floor with a loud screech of feedback, and lunged violently toward me, his hands reaching out to physically silence me. I did not flinch or take a single step back. I stood my ground in my emerald green suit, my eyes locked fiercely on his charging form. Before he could take 2 steps toward me, 3 massive men dressed in sharp, unmarked black suits materialized from the shadows, directly behind the stage curtain. Mr. Sterling had promised me absolute, uncompromising protection, and he had delivered. The private security contractors moved with terrifying speed and professional precision. They intercepted DeAndre mid-stride, tackling him aggressively to the polished wooden floor. DeAndre thrashed wildly against them, screaming profanities and demanding they release him, but the heavily muscled guards simply pinned his arms securely behind his back, pressing his face firmly against the stage he had planned to conquer. I looked down at my husband, completely stripped of his dignity, his stolen power, and his arrogant facade. The room was a roaring ocean of corporate panic, but standing right there in the bright, blinding spotlight, I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. The truth was finally out, but I was not quite finished swinging the hammer. DeAndre thrashed wildly against the heavy hands of the private security contractors, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripping at the shoulder seam. "You are completely insane!" he bellowed, his voice echoing frantically across the massive room. "You think a fake video and some forged hospital bills can take down Apex Holdings? I am the sole chief executive officer. My name is on every single piece of corporate paperwork. I own this company. I own this massive project. I own the absolute rights to the Midtown skyscraper. You are nothing but a bitter bankrupt caterer trying to extort a billionaire." I calmly unzipped the heavy black leather portfolio resting on the wooden podium. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, watching my every move with absolute terrified fascination. I pulled out the thick stack of watermarked legal documents Mr. Sterling had prepared for me. I held up the first document, allowing the bright stage lights to catch the official gold seal of the state of Georgia. "You own the glass, DeAndre." I stated, my voice echoing with icy precision. "You own the steel. You own the expensive imported marble floors and the custom Italian leather chairs in the executive boardrooms. But in commercial real estate, owning the physical building means absolutely nothing if you do not legally own the dirt underneath it." DeAndre stopped thrashing. His eyes darted nervously between my face and the heavy legal documents in my hand. "What are you talking about?" he spat, though his voice had lost a significant fraction of its booming confidence. "I bought that land from the city 3 years ago." "You signed a lease 3 years ago," I corrected him sharply. "A 99-year commercial ground lease with a highly secretive shell corporation. You paid them a massive fortune every month just to let your massive glass towers sit on their dirt. Did you ever bother to actually investigate who owned that shell corporation, DeAndre? Did your expensive corporate lawyers ever dig past the initial layers of absolute privacy? I held the document higher. Miss Ruby owned the Shell Corporation. Your mother bought that empty dirt lot 30 years ago for absolute pennies. She was your secret landlord the entire time. DeAndre stared at me in absolute horrified disbelief. No, he whispered, shaking his head frantically. That is impossible. Nothing is impossible when you systematically underestimate the women in your life, I replied coldly. I looked down at the official papers and began to read aloud for the entire room of investors to hear. 9 months ago, when Miss Ruby first discovered you were actively stealing her cancer treatment funds, she established a highly secure, irrevocable trust. She legally transferred the total undisputed ownership of the Midtown land, the Shell Corporation, and your precious ground lease entirely into that trust. She did not leave a single square inch of it to you. I paused, letting the immense gravity of my words sink into the silent, suffocated room. I looked directly into DeAndre's panicked eyes. She named me Kiara as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. I am the shadow landlord now. You built your billion-dollar empire directly on my property. The senior banking executives in the front row began whispering furiously among themselves, confirming the catastrophic legal implications of my statement. They knew exactly how vulnerable a corporate skyscraper was when the ground lease was controlled by a hostile entity. DeAndre strained his neck against the firm grip of the security guards, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. That is a lie, he screamed desperately. Even if she gave you the land, my commercial lease is ironclad. It is locked in for 99 years. I pay the rent on time every single month. You cannot touch my building. You cannot touch my company. You are bluffing to save your own pathetic ego. I smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. A standard commercial ground lease is indeed incredibly difficult to break. But Miss Ruby was a brilliant woman, and she hired an equally brilliant attorney to explicitly draft your specific agreement. I slowly turned to the second page of the heavy legal document, tracing my manicured finger down to a densely highlighted paragraph. I am going to read Section 4, Paragraph B of your ground lease. DeAndre, I announced clearly. Listen very carefully. It is the Morality and Corporate Fraud Clause. It explicitly states that if the tenant company, Apex Holdings, or its primary executive officer, is ever found guilty of committing severe financial fraud, wire fraud, or felony embezzlement, the lease agreement is instantly rendered null and void. DeAndre's eyes widened in absolute terror. He suddenly understood the massive, inescapable trap his mother had meticulously built for him. You triggered this exact clause the very first time you illegally wired Miss Ruby's stolen medical funds into your primary corporate operating accounts, I stated, my voice ringing with total authority. When you forged her signature to liquidate her secure retirement portfolios and funnel that money into Apex Holdings to artificially inflate your failing liquidity, you completely violated the foundational terms of your lease. And you compounded that felony fraud when you used those same stolen funds to purchase $1 million luxury mansion for your mistress. I gestured toward the massive digital screens which still proudly displayed the damning bank statements and the luxury property deed alongside Miss Ruby's unpaid medical bills. The undeniable evidence of your massive financial crimes is currently being photographed by every single major business reporter in this city. You did not just steal from your dying mother. You actively committed federal wire fraud and severe corporate embezzlement. DeAndre was hyperventilating, now his chest heaving as the security guards held him firmly against the floor. No, he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Kiara, please. We can negotiate this. We can settle this privately. I will give you whatever you want. I will give you half the company. You do not have a company to give me, DeAndre, I replied sharply, cutting off his desperate bargaining. The fraud clause is not negotiable. It does not require a lengthy civil trial to enforce. It is an automatic, legally binding termination trigger. Because you committed felony fraud to fund this massive development, your 99-year commercial lease is instantly and permanently voided. You do not have the legal right to let your glass tower sit on my dirt for one more second. You just lost your entire billion-dollar empire because you refused to pay for your mother's chemotherapy." The investors in the room erupted again. They realized their massive financial investments were completely tied to a fraudulent CEO who had just lost the physical ground beneath his flagship project. Men in expensive suits were actively shouting into their phones, desperately trying to salvage their portfolios before the market opened the next morning. I stepped out from behind the wooden podium holding the formal red-stamped eviction notice proudly in my hand. I looked down at DeAndre, currently pinned helplessly to the polished floor in his expensive ruined tuxedo. Then I shifted my intense gaze directly to the VIP section. Vanessa was trembling violently, her manicured hands covering her face, as she finally realized her luxurious stolen lifestyle was completely over. Chantel and Jamal were staring at me with absolute horrifying realization, fully comprehending that the endless corporate wealth they had selfishly leeched off for years was suddenly gone forever. Finally, I looked directly at the panicked executive board members, scrambling desperately in the front rows. I raised the heavy legal document high in the air for every single person to see clearly. As the sole undisputed trustee of Ruby's estate, I own the dirt under your feet. I declared, my voice echoing with final absolute judgment. Your lease is completely terminated. I am legally evicting DeAndre's corporation from my property. I walked slowly to the absolute edge of the stage, staring down at the arrogant man who had confidently handed me divorce papers just 24 hours ago. You wanted to give me exactly 48 hours to pack my cheap pots and pans and vacate my own home, DeAndre. I am going to be far less generous with your massive corporate empire. I am serving you right now with a formal, federally binding commercial eviction. You and your entire fraudulent corporation have exactly 24 hours to vacate the Midtown premises. If a single piece of your construction equipment or a single one of your corrupt employees is standing on my land by tomorrow night, I will have them forcefully removed by federal marshals for criminal trespassing. I dropped the heavy eviction notice, letting the stiff paper flutter slowly down from the high stage until it landed squarely on DeAndre's back. Sign the divorce papers whenever you finally find a cheap plastic pen in federal prison, I added coldly. The private security guards maintained their iron grip on him as he screamed my name into the wooden floorboards. The crowd parted instantly as I stepped down the stairs. I walked straight through the grand ballroom, leaving the absolute ruins of his empire burning behind me. I had barely reached the heavy velvet ropes at the rear of the ballroom when the massive double doors of the grand entrance burst violently open. The loud crash echoed over the chaotic shouting of the panicked investors. A tactical team of federal agents wearing dark jackets with large yellow FBI letters printed across the back flooded rapidly into the room. Mr. Sterling had promised to make a quiet phone call, but the federal response was anything but quiet. They moved with absolute terrifying authority, their heavy boots thudding against the polished marble as they bypassed the stunned corporate elite and marched directly toward the main stage. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, held up a thick stack of federal warrants. DeAndre, still pinned to the stage by the private security contractors, finally stopped screaming. The sheer, overwhelming reality of federal law enforcement completely broke his aggressive facade. "Stand down," the lead agent barked at the security guards. The guards immediately released their hold and stepped back, allowing the federal agents to aggressively haul DeAndre to his feet. DeAndre's expensive custom tuxedo was torn and heavily wrinkled, his face stained with sweat, and the undeniable terror of a man whose life was officially over. "You are under arrest for severe felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder," the lead agent announced, his voice projecting clearly over the deafening click of dozens of press cameras capturing every single humiliating second. The federal agents roughly forced DeAndre's arms behind his back, the sharp metallic snap of heavy steel handcuffs echoing like a final absolute judgment. DeAndre looked frantically out into the crowd of investors, desperately searching for a single friendly face, someone who would post his massive bail or offer high-powered legal counsel. But the wealthy corporate elite turned their backs on him in unison, actively pulling away, as the federal agents frog-marched the disgraced CEO straight down the center aisle. He was no longer a visionary billionaire. He was just a common thief caught stealing from his own dying mother. The brilliant flashes of the press cameras illuminated his complete destruction, ensuring his absolute humiliation would be broadcasted on the front page of every major financial news outlet in the country by morning. As the federal agents dragged DeAndre completely out of the ballroom, the devastating collateral damage of his financial crimes instantly rippled through his parasitic inner circle. I stood near the exit watching the absolute realization of total ruin wash over the people who had tormented me. Vanessa stumbled frantically through the crowd, her hands shaking violently as she scrolled through her expensive smartphone. She had just realized a terrifying legal reality. The million-dollar Buckhead mansion she proudly called her own was registered under Apex Holdings, a corporate entity that was now formally evicted and its assets entirely frozen by federal injunction. She was instantly unequivocally homeless, left with absolutely nothing but the stolen emerald ring that would inevitably be seized by federal investigators. Chantel and Jamal pushed frantically through the panicked investors, their faces pale with sickening horror. To fund their boastful lifestyle, they had taken out massive high-interest personal loans, using DeAndre's inflated corporate stock as collateral. With the company's ground lease completely terminated and its CEO arrested for federal fraud, that stock was completely worthless. They were millions of dollars in debt, with absolutely no way to pay it back. Chantel spotted me standing by the doors and sprinted toward me, her fake bravado entirely replaced by desperate, ugly sobbing. "Kiara, please," she begged loudly, reaching out with trembling hands to grab my emerald green sleeve. "You have to help us. The banks are going to take our house. Jamal will go to prison. Please, you own the land now. You have the money. We are your family." I looked down at her tear-stained face. I smoothly pulled my arm out of her frantic grasp. "You are not my family, Chantel," I said coldly. "You are a bad investment." I turned my back on their weeping and walked out the grand doors. One entire year later, the dark, suffocating memories of that fateful night felt like a distant movie I had once watched. I stood proudly in the center of the pristine, massive commercial kitchen of my brand-new, highly exclusive, upscale restaurant in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The polished stainless steel counters gleamed under the warm, inviting lights, and my dedicated staff of highly trained chefs moved seamlessly around me, preparing for the evening rush. I named the restaurant Ruby's Crown, a permanent, beautiful tribute to the brilliant woman who had handed me the keys to my absolute freedom. The heavy legal battles were long over. DeAndre was serving a mandatory 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud and elder abuse. Vanessa had quietly disappeared from the city, and Chantel and Jamal had declared total bankruptcy, moving into a tiny apartment on the outskirts of town. The Midtown commercial property was entirely mine. I negotiated a highly lucrative new ground lease with a reputable ethical corporate developer, ensuring a massive stream of generational wealth that allowed me to build my culinary dream without answering to a single soul. I was wealthy, fiercely independent, and highly respected by the same corporate elite who had once watched me walk onto that stage. I wiped my hands on my pristine white chef's apron and looked up at the highest shelf above the main prep station. Sitting right there in the center, completely preserved, was the original glass pickle jar. It was a silent, powerful reminder of the hidden strength lying beneath the surface of the things people heavily underestimate. I smiled warmly at the jar, taking a deep, satisfying breath of the rich aromas filling my beautiful kitchen. I turned to my eager front-of-house manager and gave a single confident nod. "Open the doors," I instructed clearly. "Let us feed the city." The greatest lesson from my journey is that you must never underestimate the quiet strength of someone pushed to their absolute limit. My in-laws mistook my dedication for weakness and my silence for submission. But true power does not need to be loud or boastful. It is built through patient strategy and an unwavering knowledge of your own worth. When toxic people try to strip away your dignity, Do not shrink yourself to fit their cruel narrative. Gather your strength, understand your value, and never fear dismantling the tables where respect is no longer served. You control your own destiny. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment and rebuild your life on your own terms? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. So please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more empowering journeys, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own fierce strength.